In this video, we're going to cover a topic called objects. But like always, before we dive into the main subject, I had to give a little bit of a preface. If you've been following this tutorial up until now, or if you've noticed any of my work in the past, we use another concept called variables. Variables are buckets of code where you can store information for future reference for the life of the program. Remember, those buckets or those variables can hold many different types of information, numbers, arrays, text, those sorts of things. And those buckets live for the life of the program. And once that program is over, of course, those variables disappear. And you can reference that state throughout the code. And like I said in previous lessons that we've learned, those variables all on their own only work well in small contexts. Where they fall short is when you actually expand to storing more complex pieces of information, and also when your code starts to become a little bit larger than the tiny little tidbits that we're doing in this tutorial. So in steps our savior, objects. What are objects? Objects, ladies and gentlemen, are ways in code in some languages, not all, but a good chunk of modern languages. They're ways for you to create more complex variables, should we say. What does that mean? Well, objects, which we'll dig into in a little bit here, allow you to take what we normally have referred to in this tutorial as a variable, turn it into like a variable on steroids, basically allowing you to store multiple bits, right? Multiple dimensions of variables into a single relatable object. There are lots of benefits to this. We'll dive into that. But first, let me show you what in JavaScript what an object looks like, and then we'll get into some of those examples. All right, let's get right to it. So let's create a new folder in your Coding with Paris tutorial folder here, and we'll call that lesson 6. So the way we do that here is click the outside of the folder here, click the folder icon for the Coding with Paris, this tab here, and type lesson 6, and within that folder with it highlighted here, we'll go ahead and create a file and we'll call it objects.js. And remember folks, as I usually always say, you will learn best by coding alongside me, so go ahead and create this and follow along. That will make this material stick for you. Okay, so anyway, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to talk about the basic structure of an object and what it might look like in JavaScript, and then we'll break down why they even matter. A basic object in JavaScript looks like so. We'll create a variable called contact, for example here, and what we'll do is create the open and close brackets, curly braces like this here, and we're using the familiar let to let the computer know that you're going to create a variable for us to reference later. Inside of those curly braces, we're going to first type something that looks like this. First name, Paris. Last name, you wish. Next name, favorite color. We'll just say the favorite color is black. Now let's do favorite hobby, and that is coding, of course. And then what we'll do is we'll log out the console. Now before I do that, you'll see I have a bunch of mess in here. Let's go ahead down to the console here, there in the terminal, and let's print the working directory to see where we are. So we're in that main Coding with Paris folder. Let's go ahead and go into the lesson 6 directory, and that'll get us into where we are now, where we can use npm to run our code. Right before we do that, we'll go back up here and write console.log, which is going to tell that computer to print out something for you in the console when the program is called. And we're going to say, just print out that contact object that we just created there. Let's go ahead and run the command node objects.js. So immediately what's printed out here is the contents of that object. So what's going on here? What's going on here is that in between the curly braces, what we did is we created these properties here. The property is everything before the colon, and the value that we're going to place inside of there is actually what we put after the colon. In this case, it's a string. Think of each one of these properties here as an individual variable. So we got to spell favorite, right? But each individual variable here has a value assigned to it, and all of those variables combined makes a more complex variable altogether called an object that we get to use throughout the program. You're clever. You're probably figuring out why something like this might be powerful. You see, if we refer back to how we've done things in the past where we've just created variables, where you might see is that as the program gets more complex, you end up buried in variables, because if you're just doing them like we've done in the past, you'll see that we're stacking them up at the beginning. But when you start to get to things like object, you can logically group things that make sense together and into one huge variable that you can refer to later on in your program. And again, this console is going to just lay out the variable for visual reasons. You can always log out your objects. Why else would you use objects? Objects give you a huge advantage over organization of code, which, by the way, is one aspect that makes you a great coder. If you're an excellent coder, but your stuff is not organized, you're a terrible coder, because no one else can follow your work. No one knows what the heck you're doing. So just keep that in mind. Or as your coding skills get more complex, you get a little bit better at understanding the aspects of coding. Just remember, code organization is just as important. So a lot of people use objects to represent things. Let's say you had a person object. That person object might have properties, right? Those are the things before the colon, such as eye color, which is brown, or hair color. Let's say you were making a car object. You might have a property called make, and one called model, one called car color, etc. So there are several aspects of these objects that I need you to understand so that we can use them inside of code. And we're going to talk about some of those. The first one being, how do I access pieces of information inside of an object in my code? So let's talk about that next.